It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long way to Tipperary, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to Tipperary.
There are many important years in European history: 1453, 1492, 1756, and even the French Revolution in 1789. All of these years mark a new era within European politics, culture, and economics. But what if there was a year which had the potential to overthrow nearly every nation in Europe, radically changing the fate of the century to come? Well, you don't have to imagine, as this year actually existed, 1848 as the springtime of nations, a year which was rocked by a wave of revolutions which spread throughout the continent, which, just like the French Revolution around 50 years earlier, was built off of the widespread dissatisfaction within the population for the entrenched political powers, as well as the economic divides which were now forming due to the rise of industrialization. Many of these revolutions were energized by new ideologies and democratic, liberal, and nationalist ideas that had been circulating in the European intellectual circles since the Enlightenment, as well as the ideals of the French Revolution, both in liberal ideas for political systems and in the idea of nationalism. This, combined with the rising populations and famines leading to centralization in cities, caused the revolutionary hotspots to develop in populated areas. The conditions mirrored that of the Russian Empire in the early 1900s, though ironically, Russia proper would be one of the few nations which would be relatively unaffected by the revolutions. The year initially started off with only minor uprisings in Italy, but throughout the year, these revolutionary movements would engulf most of the continent. In our timeline, a majority of these revolutions were unsuccessful, due to the aforementioned entrenched power of the conservative monarchs, as well as lack of cohesion between dissidents. Much of the lack of cohesion between dissidents was caused by the differing goals for the revolution, with some calling only for economic reform, such as the growing working class, whereas some others were calling for widespread political unifications or separations. Most peasants, however, saw a revolution as disconnected from their daily lives, and as a problem of the urban folk. Instead, they simply grew in discontent over the food shortages, but across much of Europe, the peasantry was largely unaffiliated with the revolutions. The emerging middle class also played a part in the revolutions, looking to secure political reform and have a voice over the political system of the monarchs. The divide in levels of radicalism between the urban proletariat and the bourgeoisie soon became a serious division within these revolutions. In France, for example, tensions between middle-class reformers and working-class radicals erupted in bloody street battles, showcasing the fragility of revolutionary coalitions. Nationalism in particular was a powerful force among Italians, Germans, Hungarians, and even Slavs, all seeking to form their own nation-states based off of nationalist principles. Most nobles did not respond kindly to revolutionaries, with their actions often triggering wider discontent. A prominent example of this can be seen in the Austrian minister during the time, stating that they would respond to your liberal ideas with cannon fire. Even kings who could theoretically gain from the revolutions opposed them, for fear of losing their own political power and due to their own personal disdain for revolutionary ideals to begin with. Perhaps even more significant than the revolutions themselves, the major failure of most of these revolutionary movements prompted several ideas which would shape the future of socialism. Even seeing some of the first movements of socialism spring up, mainly focusing on the social question, which is described as the concern over the growing wealth inequalities between the poor and the rich. The revolutions even influenced figures not a part of any revolutions, such as political thinkers in Britain such as Robert Owen and John Stuart Mill. Across the different nations
which were rocked by the revolutions of 1848, we can generally lump them together into three categories, albeit these categories have very substantial overlap due to the widespread ramifications of each individual revolution and their ideological roots. The first category is broadly the liberal revolutions, which sought to reduce or dismantle these monarchies which ruled over their nations. The countries which faced mostly liberal revolutions were France, Denmark, and a handful of the German states. Starting with France, After the final defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo and his exile to St. Helena, France underwent a process known as the Bourbon Restoration, wherein the French House of Bourbon was reinstated and France became a monarchy again. After a brief period of revolutionary turmoil in 1830, royal power was again secured in the July monarchy, which was a slightly more liberal monarchy supported by the British. However, inspired by the French Revolution that had preceded it and dissatisfaction with the monarchy, the French essentially led the charge in the overall revolutions of 1848 via the February Revolution, not to be confused by one in Russia of the same name, which happened a lot later. Now, the February Revolution in France saw the ousting of King Louis Philippe and the end of the constitutional monarchy that the British kind of imposed on France. This revolution, as usual, was really centered in Paris and culminated in the establishment of the French Second Republic. But then, as these things sort of tend to go, one of the Bonapartes took control and established an empire. Louis Napoleon, nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, was elected president in 1848, and in 1851 he would launch a coup ending the Republic and establishing the Second French Empire, upon which he was crowned Napoleon III. Napoleon III actually ended up being a fairly effective leader, ruling for 18 years as emperor and influencing the Crimean War and French foreign policy with Mexico and also the British, beginning industrialization and modernizing Paris. But historians tend to be not too kind to Napoleon III, given his defeat by the Prussians during the Franco-Prussian War and some of his more eccentric policies. Anyway, back to the revolutions. In Denmark, a constitutional monarchy was adopted after the death of King Christian VIII, in which King Frederick VII peacefully complied with demands from liberal revolutionaries. Further south, the March Revolution in the German states caused student protests and intellectual uprisings demanding freedom of the press and other liberal reforms. But they were eventually actually overshadowed by revolutionaries seeking to answer the social question. The countries which faced mostly economic revolutions which sought again to answer this social question were Austria, Ireland, and of course the German states, with minor uprisings in Paris, France. Parisian workers' revolutions coincided with protests over food in Galicia, and in Ireland the Irish potato famine led the Young Ireland movement to launch a revolution. In the German states, revolutionaries were deeply divided among class lines, which led the middle-class reformers and working-class radicals to quickly split, and the revolution kind of lacked a cohesive strategy because of this split. When conservative forces reasserted themselves, many of these leaders fled, joining the wave of 48ers who sought asylum in the United States. And finally, the real force that caused much of the infamy of the revolutions of 1848 was nationalism. In Italy, Austria, Hungary, Schleswig, Galicia, Greater Poland, and of course the German states, nationalism took the wheels and turned Europe on its political head. In Palermo, Sicily, in January, a revolution erupted against Bourbon rule, leading to Sicily's independence for just over a year, and priming figures like Giuseppe Garibaldi for the eventual unification of the peninsula. Further north, Charles Albert of Sardinia and Pope Pius IX felt the shake of both liberal and nationalist revolutionary forces, and both Sardinia and the Republic of San Marco would make an attempt to unify Italy, which would be crushed by the Austrians. Austria itself, however, was also feeling the burn of the revolutionary torch. In Vienna, protests forced the resignation of Chancellor Clemens von Metternich, the architect of post-Napoleonic conservatism, the concert of Europe. Besides Vienna, Hungary emerged as another epicenter of nationalist fervor within the Habsburg realm, where Lajos Kossuth, the architect of the proposed Trans-Danubian Confederation, led the Hungarian Revolution, which succeeded in winning significant concessions before Austria, with Russian assistance, reasserted control, setting the stage for the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of later 1867. Ethnic minorities in Galicia, including Ukrainians, also demanded autonomy, setting up later proposals like Aurel Popovici's United States of Austria plan, which I talk about on my own channel, US of Z. Now, in the Polish territories which were under Prussian rule, the Grand Duchy of Posen saw a brief insurrection. Polish nationalists attempted to establish a Polish state, but the Prussian government, of course, suppressed the uprising effectively. Now, there are a ton of other revolutions we could talk about, but this intro, as mine usually are, is getting far too long. By 1849, it was evident that the old regimes had managed to somehow successfully reassert their dominance, maintaining Metternich's concert of Europe. Many of the objectives sought in 1848 were paradoxically accomplished by the enemies of the revolutionaries. Bismarck would unify Germany, while Italy would achieve unification under Cavour and Victor Emmanuel II. The monarchies of Austria and Prussia abolished serfdom and feudal structures, improving the lives of millions of peasants, while monarchy led the charge of liberalization in Denmark, and Emperor Napoleon III led the same charge in France. So ironically enough, these liberal forces managed to actually succeed, albeit not in the way the revolutionaries intended. The 1848 spring would only foreshadow the impending collapse of the concert of Europe, however. The forces of radical nationalism and liberalism, which had prompted much of the revolutionary fervor in 1848, would soon influence the Bulgarians, Wallachians, Moldavians, and Serbs in the Ottoman Empire, leading to the Crimean and Balkan Wars, while nationalism bred Pan-Slavism in the Balkans, the force which brought Gavrila Princip to pull the trigger and assassinate Archduke Franz Ferdinand, from which a chain reaction would pull the states of Europe, even the newly unified nations of Germany and Italy, into a war which would char the face of the world for over a century to come. But what if that had changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the revolutions of 1848 were reversed?
Starting in Italy, in January a revolt breaks out in the island of Sicily, hoping to gain independence from the Bourbon monarchs in Naples. In our timeline, the revolution would be able to seize most of the island apart from the area around Messina. This would eventually be the spearhead for a counter-push to eventually collapse the new state on Sicily. In this timeline, we will have the revolutionaries be able to take the entirety of Sicily, and have severe internal revolts within Naples as to force the Bourbon monarchs to accept the loss of Sicily. This new Sicilian state would push for the creation of an Italian federation, as proposed and attempted in our timeline. Initially, it would be a system for economic and migratory cooperation, while resolving diplomatic disputes between states. As various states within Italy eventually accept the demands of the revolutionaries and become more sympathetic to nationalism, the federation would grow throughout 1848 and 49. Further north in the Italian peninsula, during March, two major revolts would break out against the Austrian Empire, one based in Milan and one in Venice. These revolts would gain major support from Sardinia-Piedmont, with Sardinia and even Naples joining the war in our timeline. In this timeline, the combined force of the revolutionaries, Sardinia-Piedmont, and Naples, with the support from even more Italian states such as the Papal States and Sicily, will be able to push back the Austrian forces. Especially with the major internal crises already being faced by the Austrians, their forces in Italy had a good chance of being defeated by a coalition of Italian states. Still, this war, in our timeline known as the First Italian War of Independence, would last several months and even years to finally force the Austrians into a peace settlement, and in that time, dissenters in Rome, inspired by movements in the rest of the Italian peninsula, would institute a revolution to displace the Pope as their leader, forming the Roman Republic. This revolutionary state would begin to integrate within the further Italian framework, joining the Federation and even ramping up support for the war effort. Around 1949-50, the Austrians would be forced to sign a peace, and in the peace deal the Austrian and Italian territories would join Sardinia-Piedmont, though having significant autonomy and voice in government. Over the following years, the Italian states would begin to more closely incorporate through the Italian Federation, which over time would facilitate the eventual full political unification into the Federation of Italy. Now I can already hear the comments. What about France? Wouldn't France interfere in the war by invading Rome like in our timeline? Well, as the French Revolution in early 1848 was one of the very few that ended in success, in this timeline, the revolt that would put Napoleon III as president, ultimately ending in the creation of the Second French Empire, would be crushed by Bourbon soldiers. The Bourbons, even in our timeline, were pro-Italian unification, and especially since this led to a weakening of the Austrians, the Bourbons may even support the Italians to attempt to sway the Italians into their sphere. Apart from this, there are very minimal short-term consequences to a maintenance of Bourbon power, most likely just being a continuation of the status quo. In Germany in our timeline, the most major revolution led to the creation of the Frankfurt Parliament, a parliament consisting of representatives from all the different states in the German Confederation, and it was hoped to be used as a political unification of all the German states into a single kingdom, under a constitutional monarchy led by the King of Prussia. Unfortunately, in our timeline, the King of Prussia, Frederick William IV, would refuse the crown due to the limitations set on his own personal power. The lack of real authority backed up by a powerful monarchy ultimately spelled the end for the Frankfurt Parliament. But in this timeline, we'll have Frederick William IV accept the crown of Germany despite the restrictions set on his power, seeing it as an opportunity to cripple the Austrians in their time of struggle. This would result in a similar federative model like Italy being set up. Initially, the only changes would be the unification of foreign affairs and the reduction in internal trade restrictions. However, it would soon consolidate under further Prussian political, military, cultural, and economic hegemony within the Union. One notable exception of the joining of the Union would be Bavaria, which in our timeline underwent a revolution to remove its absolute monarchy under King Ludwig, an increasingly reactionary and repressive king, who, unwilling to rule as a constitutional monarch, abdicated in preference of his son. In this timeline, the popular revolution would be violently suppressed, and the king would seek to destroy any revolutionary sentiment within Bavaria, and thus would be incredibly hostile to the liberal and revolution-founded German Union. King Ludwig would maintain a strong distance from the rest of Germany, hoping to tie himself to other authoritarian nations such as France and Russia for defense against the newly unified Germany. One final revolution in this area that shouldn't go mentioned is the revolution in Posen by Polish nationalists, who hoped to gain independence from the Germans, especially as the Frankfurt Parliament was being established, and it seemed that the voices of the Polish people were under risk of being drowned out by the growing strength of the Germans. In this timeline, the Prussian government will be heavily distracted by the political struggles of attempting to unify Germany, and with the support from the autonomous Polish province in Russia, the Polish in Posen would force Prussia to recognize their independence. Finally, we move on to the big event, the Austrian Empire. Throughout 1848, there were revolutions in nearly every corner of the empire, and apart from the aforementioned Italian revolt, there were revolutions in Bohemia, Hungary, Transylvania, Galicia, and even in Austria itself. It would start with a revolution against the central government, attempting to remove various reactionary government officials, most prominently the state chancellor and foreign minister, Prince Metternich. Following this revolution, the Hungarian, Transylvanian, and Galician parts of the empire attempted to form their own kingdoms based on nationalism during this time of weakness for the Austrian government. In our timeline, these revolts were mainly quelled due to Russian interference to save the Austrian Empire from near-complete collapse. However, in this timeline, seeing the revolutions as an opportunity to radically increase Russia's own influence in both Central Europe and the Balkans, the Russian Emperor Nicholas I will not assist the Austrians, and may even give supplies to the revolutionaries. This is essentially a death knell to the Austrian Empire, who, while attempting to deal with a new inefficient government, counter-revolutionaries in Austria, and the continuing war in Italy, is barely able to halt the advances of the revolutionaries, much less defeat them, and thus all three revolutionary groups are given full independence. However, following the loss of these territories, as well as humiliation against the Italians leading to more lost land, the Czechs would begin to fear that the liberal government in Austria would attempt to unify with the rest of the Germans, and major revolts would break out all across Bohemia. The central government, which would be facing a full-on civil war within Austria proper, would be unable to quell this uprising, and would be forced to guarantee the independence of Czechia. Following this, the liberal government of Austria would finally stabilize control over what remained of the Austrian Empire, with Franz Joseph as its constitutional monarch. This is what Europe looks like after the revolutions of 1848 are all complete, and needless to say, this is going to be a radically different world than our own. We have a unified and federal Italy and Germany around 50 years before our timeline, a completely destroyed Austrian Empire, and a France without Napoleon III. Immediately following the revolutions, most states would be likely working to reorganize their nations and attempt to re-establish a sense of normalcy within their state. Moving forward, the fragile constitutional monarchy of Austria would hold elections, divided between those in favor of unification and those opposed to it. It is likely that those in favor of unification would be in the majority, due to Germans now constituting the majority of the population, and the current state of the government being highly unstable and inefficient. Unfortunately, the pro-unificationists would find Germany itself highly resistant to unification, due to the aforementioned fragility and instability of the Austrian state. but also its maintained control over Croatia, which would both not fit into a union specifically designed for Germans, but also acts as a potential catalyst for war with both Italy and Hungary, which have their own designs in the region. So for now, the Austrian kingdom would attempt desperately to reform, likely undergoing several revolutions before a stable and effective government takes charge. Speaking of Germany, the Union of German States would slowly centralize around Prussia due to its naturally hegemonic position due to its land, industry, and political influence that it holds over the German states. This political dominance would also, however, lead to the Frankfurt Parliament slowly losing power to the Prussian king, who would slowly centralize his control over the states of the Union and claw back power from the Parliament, leaving the Parliament, though still powerful, unable to oppose the now Emperor directly. This German Empire would desire to reclaim its Polish lands in the east, and so would sign an agreement with the Russians, with them both recognizing each other's claims to ethnically Polish lands, with the Germans reclaiming Posen and the Russians moving in to take control of Galicia. Russia itself, almost entirely unaffected by the revolutions, now sets its sights towards the Balkan, where they have near complete freedom to act against the Ottoman Empire. In this alternate 1853, the Russians would march into Ottoman lands, which though opposed by Britain would not see active opposition from France or Italy, as France without Napoleon III would be much more focused on non-European affairs and would likely not want to risk a war with Russia, and Italy would not need support from the Western powers for a future unification like it did in our timeline for obvious reasons. Due to no other powers putting up extreme opposition to Russia, Britain is forced to not intervene, as it wouldn't risk a war against Russia all by themselves. Due to the lack of intervention, Russia is able to blast into the Balkans, supported by Slavic revolutions throughout the Ottoman territories. In the end, Russia would be prevented from taking Constantinople due to British threats of joining the war, but the entirety of the rest of the Balkans would be divided up between different Slavic states loyal to Russia, while the Romanian principalities are increasingly forced into the Russian orbit, securing Russia's dominance of the Balkans. Hungary would also not stay stagnant for long, likely moving to conquer Transylvania as soon as they would have the chance to. Throughout their realms, they would undergo massive Hungarianization, attempting to quash any potentially insurrectionary ethnic groups and transform the lands of the South Slavs, Romanians, and Slovaks into loyal Hungarian territories. Even with this goal, the Hungarians would still keep their eye on obtaining Croatia from Austria, which they saw as a rightful territory of Hungary that was stolen from them. Italy would begin to institute reforms and internal reorganization of states to achieve faster integration processes. And because of their focus on internal reformation and state building, they would not commit to any external plays. Culturally, Italy would become slowly more similar, with a unified language, cultural icons, and national heroes being established to stress the identity of Italians as a unified people. However, the largely federal and decentralized model of the Italian state would make integration campaigns very slow, especially of areas with distinct cultural differences, such as in the south or in Venice. This may see overall similar levels of cultural unity in our timeline in some areas, most notably in the north and in Rome. However, there would be regions which would remain largely culturally distinct, and may even become more divorced from the general Italian culture, as those in those regions tried to stress the uniqueness of their territory. After significant centralization and cultural unification policies have been enacted, however, Italy would begin to look outward, likely seeking an alliance with the French, and beginning to look to take South Tyrol, Istria, and the Dalmatian coast from Austria. In the late 1800s, there would be an agreement between Hungary and Italy on the division of Croatia, with them both invading Austria at the same time. Needless to say, these two states would easily overwhelm the meager Austrian forces, and swiftly take control over Croatia. In Austria itself, there would likely be a mass popular revolt against the current government, seeking to unify Austria into the German Empire due to the Austrian government's inability to protect the nation. These revolts may also spread to the nearby kingdom of Bavaria and the German Barts of Bohemia, whose people would have throughout the 19th century seek to unify with the rest of Germany, but the monarchs would oppose any such actions. Ultimately, the German Empire, eager to unify with the rest of the German states, would support these revolts, collapsing the Austrian and Bavarian kingdoms, as well as seizing some land from Bohemia, while Croatia is divided between Italy and Hungary. Through the rest of the 19th century, two main power blocs would form: the Eastern Bloc, formed between Germany, Russia, and Hungary, and the Western Bloc, comprising of Britain, France, and Italy. Germany would seek to take the territory of Alsace-Lorraine from France, as well as wanting to build a European empire. Russia would hope to weaken the British Empire and finally take control of Constantinople, which would have up to this point been blocked by the West, while Hungary would want to secure its alliance with its rich and powerful neighbors to truly elevate Hungary to the status of great power, while also designing to reclaim the Dalmatian coast from Italy. The French and British would aim to curb both German and Russian expansionism, as their combined might could soon become unstoppable, while Italy aimed to take the entirety of the Dalmatian coast, gain colonies, and set up a sphere of influence in the Balkan. In the early 20th century, the balance of power in Europe would essentially thus have teetered on fragile alliances, mutual distrust, and an escalating simultaneous great power militarization. In this increasingly tense atmosphere, it would not be a question of if war would erupt, but when and why. The catalyst would come on a warm spring day in 1914 in the city of Fiume, where Giovanni Giolitti, the former Italian prime minister and one of the architects of Italy's nationalist foreign policy, would be assassinated by a Hungarian nationalist in broad daylight. The Italian government, under intense public pressure, would then issue an ultimatum to Hungary. Most demands were accepted, but Hungary rejected two key provisions involving an Italian-led inquiry into the assassins, refusing to cede any control over the investigation. On June 28, 1914, Italy would declare war on Hungary, setting off a chain reaction that engulfed Europe. Germany, bound by its alliance to Hungary, declared war on Italy. Britain and France, unwilling to allow German aggression to go unchecked, declared war on Germany. Russia, already mobilizing, saw Britain's involvement as a direct threat to its influence and entered the fray. Soon after the declarations, Germany would launch a massive assault on France through Belgium, seeking a swift victory to reclaim Alsace-Lorraine. But, as in our timeline, the German advance would bog down into a bitter stalemate. Trench warfare would thus dominate the Western Front, with France and Britain bearing the brunt of the fighting. But Germany, with control over Austrian and Bavarian territories, had a deeper reserve of manpower and resources, making for an even bloodier and more deadly trench warfare campaign. Italy and Hungary waged a brutal war along the Dalmatian coast. Italy's naval superiority allowed it to bombard Hungarian positions and blockade their ports. But Hungary's well-organized, though linguistically somewhat divided army and strategic reinforcements from Germany kept Italy from making significant territorial gains inland. Russia's troops also joined Hungary in the region, tipping the balance further against the Italians on land. Just to the south, to prevent Russian naval ambitions in the Mediterranean, Britain would occupy the Dardanelles, effectively cutting off Russian access to the Bosphorus Strait. This much, of course, provoked outrage in Russia, but also in Bulgaria, who would both promptly launch an invasion of Thrace. The Ottomans, caught between the British and the Eastern Bloc, would resist Russian and Bulgarian advances, creating a chaotic three-way struggle for control over the straits. This Great War would essentially devolve into one of attrition, with the Russians unable to break Britain's blockade, the Italians getting pushed back to their controlled ports, and a brutal stalemate in the West that continued to claim more and more lives for seemingly nothing. Public sentiment in the British Isles began to sour as the war's cost mounted without clear victories, especially as Italy's inability to deliver a decisive blow in the Adriatic and Dalmatian campaigns, the very axiom which started the conflict, became more and more apparent. Then, in 1916, Germany, redirecting resources from its eastern allies, would launch a massive sweeping offensive in France. The French military would crumble under the pressure, forcing Britain and France to negotiate an armistice to prevent further losses. At the Treaty of Lausanne, the Western Bloc would be forced to make significant concessions. Of course, we'd see Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, while Hungary would gain significant southern Dalmatian territories from Italy. The Dardanelles Straits would be designated as a British-controlled international zone, and Italy, humiliated by its losses and perceived betrayal of Britain and France, would be left with only nominal territory in the northern Adriatic and a tarnished national pride. The Great War's modern military brutality would leave Europe changed just as it had in our own timeline. But it was, of course, Italy who emerged most profoundly bewildered. In the wake of its defeat, many in the Italian Federation erupted into anger.
The war's outcome was not seen necessarily as a failure of Italian strategy per se, but as a betrayal by Britain and France, who refused an honorable fight to the end. This so-called Great Stab in the Back fueled a resentment against Italy's allies and hunger for revenge against Hungary. As Germany, satisfied with its victory, turned its attention overseas, and Russia, having gained nothing from the war, faced a civil war and revolution in response to their troubles, Italy underwent an ideological metamorphosis. Italian poet Gabriele D'Annunzio left his estate in Gardone Riviera and began to tour the Italian countryside, giving speeches and rallying support in the papers and on stage. A poet and fervent Italian nationalist, D'Annunzio had essentially helped to craft a national identity for Italy in the late 19th and early 20th century through his writings, which drew on folklore, history, and myth from across the peninsula, synthesizing it into a sort of national mythos. Not unlike the Brothers Grimm in Germany, D'Annunzio's writings profoundly shaped a sense of Italianness amongst the educated in Italy. D'Annunzio became a consequential artistic, romantic, and political force in post-war Italy. D'Annunzio would soon form the Party for the Reunification of the Adriatic Peoples with Italy, with its symbol of the Roman fasces, a bundle of sticks tied together representing the many peoples of Italy who, as one nation, would forge their own destiny. His revanchist party gained traction among Italians disillusioned by the war's outcome, and again, the perceived betrayal by Britain and France, a cowardly betrayal. He promised a revival of Italian strength and the reclamation of its rightful Adriatic Empire. D'Annunzio launched a political campaign to restructure the Italian state through economic reorganization into corporations and syndical guilds, and a militarization of society. After becoming Prime Minister of Italy in 1922, D'Annunzio peered east, across the sea, at his next great ambition. The peace brokered by the Treaty of Lausanne had not brought stability. It had merely delayed the conclusion to this epic conflict. Prime Minister Gabriele D'Annunzio, his voice booming as he spoke to the crowds of Rome, was ready to ignite the flames of war once more.
But that's all for this episode, and I hope you enjoyed this extra long video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to both mine and the USFZ's channels, who I couldn't have made this video without. Comment down below any suggestions you have for future video topics. On screen now is a video which YouTube thinks you'll like. Stay crazy!